Welcome back to the Up-Level Dairy Podcast. I'm Peggy Coffeen, and today we are bringing you a session that was presented at World Dairy Expo 2024 on behalf of the National Milk Producers Federation and the Farm Program. If you missed this session live, now is your chance to get up to speed on H5N1 as we hear from Dr. Jason Lombard from Colorado State University, who has been studying this virus since its early findings, Dr. Keith Poulson from the Wisconsin Veterinary Diagnostic Lab, Miquela Hanselman, who leads the Farm Program's Biosecurity efforts, and two dairy producers, Brent Wilson from Michigan, who opens up on how H5N1 impacted his herd and what others can learn from this experience, alongside California producer Brian Pacheco as he strategizes to protect his herd from the outbreak in his area that has not yet touched his dairy. Exclusive insights, H5N1 biosecurity and management strategies for dairy farms, and what a timely topic and a relevant topic on the minds of dairy producers across the country and those in the industry who are serving them. I'm Peggy Coffeen. I will be facilitating the conversation this morning among many experts in the industry that will be sharing different sides and different experiences and knowledge that they have on this topic of H5N1. And so to get us started this morning, and I'll go ahead and just give a moment for others to come on in and take a seat and get settled in. We've got plenty of room. And while you're getting settled in, I'll go ahead and introduce the first of many experts that will be sharing their experiences and their knowledge with us this morning. And our first one will be Dr. Jason Lombard, Associate Professor at Colorado State University. And this is where he received his doctorate in veterinary medicine. He practiced dairy cattle medicine in Wisconsin for nearly 10 years before returning to Colorado State University and completing his master's degree in epidemiology. And during this time, he worked for the USDA's National Animal Health Monitoring System. He coordinated multiple national studies, primarily focused on the dairy industry. And while with the USDA, he also participated on an incident management team and was deployed for multiple cattle and poultry diseases during his 20-year federal career. And could we have anyone better qualified to talk about this topic and an early person and being involved in the study of this disease? Join me in welcoming Dr. Jason Lombard.
Thank you. And thanks for the invitation to be here. And this is a subject I think some of us are tired of talking about, but we still need to keep talking about it because we need to kind of solve it and try to prevent it. So I did work with USDA for 20 years. I went to Colorado State, moved to Colorado State about a year ago, so no longer with USDA. But I need to put this disclaimer up because sometimes I'm still suspected of working for USDA and I don't. So this is my own conclusions and findings. But some of the data that I'm going to present today is based on a cooperative agreement I have with USDA, and access to the data was partly because of this one. So I've got a short period of time to hopefully tell you a lot about what we don't know about HPAI. We'll start a little bit about background. We'll talk about disease spread, clinical signs in cows, and then some of the cow and herd level impacts. So when we talk about influenza, there's really four types of influenza. Influenza A and B, which usually cause epidemics in people. The influenza C really causes mild disease, no epidemics, so you're not going to hear about influenza C. And then influenza D, which is primarily found in cows. So you think today we'd be talking about influenza D. Unfortunately, we're not. We're talking about influenza A, which causes the seasonal global epidemics in people. So that's one of the reasons that we're concerned about this virus. It's divided into two subtypes based on these proteins. Oops, wrong button. On these proteins, I don't know if you can see that now. On the surface of the virus, the hemagglutinin and the neuraminidase, the H and N surface proteins. So the current outbreak that we're seeing in dairy cattle, if you want to know the whole name, is the H5N1 clade 2.3.4.4b genotype B3.13. So you might see it in a lot of different ways, but that's really the cattle genotype that we've seen. So some significant disease dates. This is a disease that we've been dealing with for a long time in the U.S. So February 8, 2022, we confirmed high bath in a commercial poultry flock in Indiana. And we've really been working, before I left USDA, deployed to multiple states to try to fight this disease. Unfortunately, in poultry, It does cause a lot of mortality, and so when we find it in poultry flocks, turkey flocks, those animals are depopulated to try to slow the virus down. In early 2024, there was an uncharacterized cattle morbidity event occurring in the Southwest, and there were reports of large birds and die-offs associated with that outbreak in cattle. There was a lot of work done trying to figure out, is this winter dysentery, what's going on with these cattle, and eventually, through some additional testing of birds and cats and the finding of highly pathogenic avian influenza, we detected it in cattle. So that was on March 25th when USDA confirmed that. A month later, they enforced the federal order pertaining to high path AI, and I'll just talk a couple sentences about that really. And then as of yesterday, 244 dairy herds in 14 states affected. This is the number of herds that have disclosed that they have the disease, not the number of herds that actually have the disease. We know there are quite a few herds in multiple states that didn't disclose that they had this illness moving through their cows. So what are our current challenges? So we're 6 months into this almost. And how is the virus moving from herd to herd? We still don't know all the methods that it's moving. We know that it moves through lactating cattle. It's interesting that when lactating cattle move, a lot of times those animals aren't showing clinical signs, but the resident cows will become clinical. How is it moving cow to cow? We know that the majority of virus that we find is excreted in the milk. So how big a factor is the milk in terms of disease transmission? And then we have these young cattle and non-lactating cattle that we really don't know their role in disease spread at this point. And there hasn't been a lot of focus on them, but they're starting to be more and more focused. And then as reinfection or relapse are already occurring on farms, we're on 2 farms in Colorado that have been dealing with this for 4 months. And they still see about 5 new cases a week on both these farms. They think it's maybe related to their offsite dry cow facility. They bring naive cows back in, and are they getting exposed? But who's shedding it in the herd that's exposing those cows coming back in 4 months after their initial clinical signs? So this is the USDA website that I mentioned, 244 farms that have reported. I think Colorado, unfortunately, still leads with 64 infected farms, and we're doing weekly bulk tank samples, so we have a pretty good idea that that's the number of infected farms in Colorado. I think California, unfortunately, is trying to catch us with the number of cases that they have. So this is the information on the federal order. Really, I think all you need to know is mandatory testing for interstate movement. So you need to do either milk testing or nasal swab testing. I believe it's 8 days prior to movement. And if those animals are positive on the test, then they're not going to be able to move. The other thing that came out of the federal order was mandatory reporting. There's a lot of private labs that do testing that weren't necessarily required to report if they had a positive sample. And the federal order did require that. Those private labs now have to report to the state and federal officials if they find it positive. Okay, so this is a CDC graphic that talks about all the different ways that it's spreading. And so I think that the wild bird to cow, that's how this all started. And based on all the genomic sequences that we have, the experts have looked at it and said this was a one-time event. We had wild migratory birds that transmitted this infection to cattle, probably in Texas, New Mexico area. Since then, we have not seen any additional wild bird to cattle transmission. So it's not the wild birds, the wild migratory waterfowl that are continuing to spread this disease. Cow to cow, yes, it is spreading cow to cow. How is it spreading? We don't have a really good handle on that, although milk is thought to be one of the primary routes. I think there's some research suggesting maybe that's not quite as readily transmissible as we thought. Cow to poultry, we have had cow to poultry probably through shared workers that shared housing with dairy and poultry farms. Cow to cat, probably through the consumption of raw milk. Cow to human, the route is unknown, probably through milk is what we're thinking. We primarily saw that in milkers and potentially getting milk in their eye or rubbing their eye during milking and seeing the conjunctivitis that maybe you've all seen those pictures. Human to human, at the time this was written, no human to human spread. I think the Missouri case that maybe you've been following where they have a person with H5N1 that didn't have any exposure to cattle, doesn't drink raw milk, but then did have a family member that had similar signs associated with H5N1 infection. And then ultimately, I think there were some healthcare workers that were also showing clinical signs of disease. So is it being spread human to human? Yes, and we heard that from our dairy producers early on, that they would take it home to their workers. They would take it home to their family members who never stepped foot on the farm, and they would end up with some of the conjunctivitis, the red eyes, and some potential flu-like symptoms. The other thing that we do know has happened is poultry back to cows. Likely in Michigan, where there was a poultry farm in close proximity to a dairy farm. We know that in poultry farms, they put out a lot of aerosol virus, and then the fans blow that out of the barn and can spread that. In cattle, we haven't been able to really prove that aerosol spread is an issue, but I'll show you some epidemic curves here that suggest that the cattle are all exposed at one point in time. All right, so when I was deployed to Michigan, one of the first things we looked at was milk trucks. You can see the milk residue on the side of the truck. We sampled that. We sampled tires. We sampled the down tube coming out of the overflow up here. We sampled the back of the direct load trailers. We took the cap off and swabbed all this. On these farm loads, we sampled the hose, the dipper, the cooler, the floor of the cabinet. We took 126 samples on 18 milk trucks, and we had one that they called non-negative or positive. I don't know why they like the non-negative designation. But we had one positive sample out of 126, and we said milk trucks aren't the big risk that we thought they were going to be, given that we know the highest viral load is in the milk. So if it's not the milk trucks, what's the next thing on the list that's transmitting? So when we start looking at disease spread risks, some of the known risks, lactating cattle. The lactating cattle have been the primary movers of the disease from state to state. But once we get the disease in a state, then it seems like it spreads through multiple different routes. People. I think that people are moving it, not only service personnel, visitors to the farm, but potentially employees, potentially dairy owners. So we've seen some cases where that looks like that could be the most likely means of disease movement. Assume risk with service personnel, a lot of vehicle movements. Dairies are just really busy places. There's a lot of people coming in and off a dairy on a daily basis. How do we keep our animals safe from all these movements that are going on? Assumed low risk, feces and manure. So in terms of feces, I think I've seen one sample where we detected very low levels of virus in feces, direct feces from cattle. But manure, which includes urine, and we have found the virus in urine from cows. So when we think about lagoons, could that be a risk? And we have found low amounts of virus in lagoons, in manure spreading equipment. Is that really a risk to other cattle, to poultry farms? It's assumed to be a low risk at this point. Some other low risk things, milk trucks, we talked about that. Migratory waterfowl, as I mentioned, there's been that one event where it looks like it went from wild birds to cattle, and we haven't seen that since. And actually, we haven't found this B313 genotype in wild birds in 2024. So we have not seen that again, really. And then the peridomestic birds or waterfowl, really just birds, pigeons, starlings, things that we're going to see commonly around dairy farms. We've gone on site 2 to 3 weeks after clinical signs on a lot of these farms, and we find somewhere in the neighborhood of 5% of those birds have the virus. Probably they were exposed to the cattle, not likely the source of introduction of disease to the cattle. Okay, so one of the things that we know, this is a graph courtesy of Dr. Drew Megstedt, that he had access to some bulk tank milk samples out of Texas, and they actually had samples that were banked prior to this herd having clinical signs. And if you look over here, and we're looking at this test, this is a PCR test, so this is this is actually negative on his test, it's 38, and then as the drops, that means there's more virus. So as the number goes down, it's counterintuitive, there's more virus that they detected. So you can see out here about 18 days prior to clinical signs, they started seeing virus in the milk. And it peaked or had the highest amount of virus. The lowest CT value was about 4 days after clinical signs. So what's going on out here is what we really need to know about, because that's when the exposure occurred. By the time we get out to where we're a few days past clinical signs, we've missed this window of opportunity to see how the disease is spreading early on. And so how is it spreading? In different exposures. So we know we found it early on in nasal secretions. They found that in experimentally infected cattle. Is there aerosols? Are the cattle ingesting it somehow? We know that the highest load, as I mentioned, is in the milk. So what's the risk of that in terms of in the parlor and transmitting it to other cows, transmitting it to workers? Could through milking machines, could that milk get ejected back up into other cows and cause disease that way? We haven't found it in feces, really, and we have found it in urine a little bit. So most of these are low, except for milk. And then we really need more research to find out, is this an aerosol? Is this something that's spreading on the farm that way? Because it doesn't appear that milk is the primary cause of spread. In a lot of farms, it's hard to interpret the USDA at the report that they just put out, but it looks like somewhere around 50 to 60% of the farms did not bring on any lactating cattle in the 30 days prior to showing clinical signs. So clinical signs, and I appreciate Dr. Dersh's article that he put together a few months ago that talked about a herd that had a lot of biometric data, and this is what they essentially saw. They saw fevers in their cows 4 to 5 degrees above normal, and those fevers usually lasted for about 2 days. And I heard a lot of veterinarians that were palpating cows that would detect a herd that way. They just had a lot of fevers, and then they'd have the herds checked out and tested. So rumination decreased about 6 hours after the start of the fever. Water intake was severely decreased. Feed intake was severely decreased. Activity as well. These cows have a depressed attitude. I think some of the initial signs were mastitis, thick yellow milk, but it could look like just a normal mastitis as well. It doesn't have to be thick and yellow. Nasal discharge, which we've seen a lot in some of these herds that are 2 to 3 weeks past clinical signs. And then abortions are something that we hear a lot about when we really haven't got a good handle on how big of a deal that is at this point. So the first clinical sign we're going to see is the temperature, the fever in these cows. All cows have a temperature. These are cows with fevers. And then over on the right is some of the milk that associated with one of the cases. So this is a cow that we saw. This cow had just been pulled that morning. You can see she's kind of depressed. Her ears are down, and you can see this nasal discharge dripping out of both nostrils. And we were just talking about this earlier. How much have we really focused on nasal discharge in cows previously? So we're attributing all this to high-path AI, but we really haven't focused on this. And maybe some of this is somewhat a little bit normal. This would not be normal. Bloody noses in cows. This cow actually was in pretty bad shape and was euthanized. This is a herd that we're working with that's a couple months out, and they had a lot of cows with just some serosanguinous discharge, bloody noses, and it's since cleared up. And now they're back to kind of the serous, clear nasal discharge. This is another herd. This is a herd that we're working with that's about 3 months out, and they're getting really the mucopurulent kind of discharge in these cows. This was that herd I mentioned. If you look down, this is in the parlor. I mean, there is just a lot of nasal discharge, pretty much clear nasal discharge in these cows. So that's one of the things that we're seeing a lot of after they kind of get through the initial clinical signs. This is another cow. She had a lot of peeling back by her hip. She also had peeling up by her withers here. She was a pretty thin cow. She wasn't in good shape, and she got euthanized as well. So I think one of the things I take away from this is this disease is so variable, not only at the cow level, but at the herd level, and you never know what you're going to get. We're working with the 2 herds that owned by the same group. They have the offsite dry cow facility. They saw completely different kind of clinical signs and the impacts. Abortions in one of their herds, a lot of mortality in the other herd. It just doesn't make sense why it's so variable from farm to farm and some cow to cow. So another thing that we saw is this cow, we put her in the headlocks to test her, And she was just drooling so much that within a couple minutes, she just had a big puddle in the feed. And you wonder, well, if this actually has virus in it, then does the next cow come up, consume that feed? Or does that feed get pushed up, combined, and then fed to other animals? Could that be a source? And then just some nasty nasal discharge. So if we look at how quickly the cases are happening on these farms, these are 4 different farms. It seems that for the most part, it follows what we think would be a point source, meaning that you don't see a bunch of peaks over an extended period of time, because these herds are really only seeing clinical signs for about 16 days to 38 days that we reported. This farm K was interesting. They had so many cases that they had to convert a couple lactating pens to their sick pen. So so resource-wise, they were constrained. They just took any cow that looked at them crosswise and put them in that sick pen. And that's why they had 50% of their sick cows. And we're talking about 800 cases. So they put over 400 cows in their pen in one day just because that's what they had to do to manage their cows. Otherwise, for the most part, farms are going to be over this in pretty close to 2 to 4 weeks, at least with that initial onset of clinical signs. So at the individual cow level, this graph is showing rumination here in the orange, and this cow is running at about 500 minutes per day and dropped to about 50 minutes per day during her clinical episode. And then in the blue is her milk production, and we look over here on the right. She was given about 100 pounds. She dropped to less than 20, and then she came back and she's kind of hovering around 70. And then some of the researchers have looked at this at a herd level, and it looks like they're resetting that lactation curve about 30% lower than what they were prior to the clinical disease. So the big question is, what happens to that cow the next lactation, right? We know in experimentally infected cows there is some scar tissue that they see within the mammary gland, and is that actually functionally preventing them from producing as much milk as they did before? So for treatment, these are really viral infections, so really supportive care is the biggest thing. Antibiotics if they have secondary bacterial infections, but not recommended for every cow by any means. Anti-inflammatory drugs and aspirin seems to be working pretty well from what we've heard on these farms. Electrolytes and rehydration are probably the biggest thing that you can do, but it takes a lot of resources. I just heard somebody talking about giving 250 cows electrolytes every day. And then increased fiber in the diet seems to, since these cows are off feed and have a kind of a sour gut. We heard a story of a farmer that he moved all of his sick cows into a bigger pen that had a corn stalks windbreak, and they were delivering TMR, but the cows devoured the corn stalks. So we had other farms that they just put big bales of hay in with their sick cows, and that seemed to, the cows were definitely congregating and eating a lot of fiber. So just some cow level impacts. This farm's been out quite a ways, so we have a little bit of data in terms of production and reproduction to show. So this was Farm A on the previous graphs, but 22% of their cows out of 3,600 were detected as being sick. So this was back in April when they broke. I just pulled their dairy comp records. Out of about the 800 sick cows, only 50% of them remain in the herd. So this is a little bit of an abnormal herd in terms of they have a lot of access to heifers. So they did do a lot of replacements. They did a lot of culling based on this disease. A few of them are still in the herd, 2.6 additional that are do not breeds. 8.5% of them died, and almost 40% of them were sold. So pretty big impacts overall of this herd in terms of the cows that were lost. If we look at their 21-day pregnancy risk, and right in here would be about when they broke with clinical signs. Right now, I mean, they took a pretty big hit in March, and then it seemed like they kind of bounced back. The other thing that is hard in some of these herds is we're getting into summer. We know that the reproductive efficiency is going to be hurt in that time frame. I did put 22, 23 up here to kind of give it as a comparison. But it does look like they've taken a little bit of hit in terms of their pregnancy risk over that period of time. What about impact on future milk production? So what we did is we took this, so this is for the survivors, so the 50% of cows that were still in the herd that had the disease, And I did some minimum days in milk cutoffs because Dairy Comp will calculate a peak milk, but I wanted to kind of look and see what had happened if we did it at 60. So any cow that at least had 60 days in milk, there were 96 cows in this herd. They were down 2.5 pounds of peak milk, but down 3,000 pounds of MD305 milk. If I change that cutoff to 80, so we maybe get a little better idea of what their peak's going to be, we have the number of cows down at 1.7 pounds of milk, but still about 3,000 in MD305. And then if I put the cutoff at 90 days in milk before I allowed those cows to have a peak, then we only lost 0.5 pound of milk, which wasn't significantly different compared to what they had the previous lactation. So we paired each cow with herself, but we know that cows generally give more milk as they move from lactation to lactation. So this is probably a little bit significant in terms of overall milk production and changing 305 about 3,300 pounds. So one herd, not very many cows, but it looks like there is an impact on milk production in the next lactation. How big that is, I don't know. We'll have to follow those cows out, but we'll see where that goes. At least these cows aren't producing 30% less than what they would have produced before. This is not a very good picture, but this is the dead truck on one of the dairies when we were sampling, and it was far away. It was driving where it wasn't supposed to. This white cow on top looks like she's standing up on top of all these other cows. Mortality is an issue. I've said the 8.5% on that one farm that we looked at. We've had other farms that have run 10, 12, 13% mortality, but we've had farms that have been 0% mortality. So when you get an average, it might not tell you. You want to know what kind of the extremes are. So this disease is definitely variable. Just a couple slides on herd level changes. The big thing that we see is changes in bulk tank somatic cell count and changes in daily milk per cow or total milk shipped. This herd had their first clinical signs here. We used the prior 30 days as the baseline to set that at 0. They saw, with a rolling 3-day average, a 15% decrease in daily milk per cow and a 126% increase, or a little more than doubling of their bulk tank somatic cell count. And for the month of May, they shipped 10% less milk than they did in the prior 2 months. So with that, I'd like to thank all the people that are out. We're doing a lot of sampling of cows to look and see how long they're shedding the virus. So we got a lot of group, USDA for the funding. The dairy producers are allowing us to come and work with their cows and the cows. And if you want to make a cow mad, just do nasal swabs on her twice a week for about 5 weeks. And so, all right.
And with that, Dr. Lombard, we'll have you take a seat up here on our panel and ask our other panelists to come on up, and we're going to dig a little bit deeper into what Dr. Lombard has shared. And you have the privilege of hearing from a couple of other experts on this topic, as well as 2 dairy producers. And we have here in the red, this is Ms. Miquela Hanselman, the Director of Regulatory Affairs with National Milk. She joined NMPF in 2019 and leads NMPF's regulatory-focused efforts on nutrition and public health, including the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. She also oversees NMP's efforts for the National Conference on Interstate Milk Shipments, the Multi-Sector Tuberculosis Working Group, and NMPF's internship program. She is the program lead for Farm Biosecurity, focused on protecting the health of dairy farmers' herds and employees. She received her bachelor's degree in animal science and master's in public health with a concentration in food systems from Cornell University. A participant up here with many talents, many credentials, and biosecurity is among them all. Welcome, Miquela. Yes, go ahead and clap for her. And over on the other side of Miquela here is one of our dairy producers that's joining us today. This is Brent Wilson. He's the owner and operator of Wilson Centennial Farms in Carson City, Michigan. He milks 1,000 cows, and Brent has for a long time been very proud of his farm's accomplishments. Wilson Centennial Farms has won numerous milk quality awards, including the National Platinum Milk Quality Award from the National Mastitis Council. He also sits on the MMPA Board of Directors, that's the Michigan Milk Producers, and works closely with Michigan State University Extension. Please give a welcome to Brent Wilson. And our other producer joining us today is Brian Pacheco, a fourth-generation dairyman from California. In addition to milking 1,400 Holsteins and serving as the former chairman of California Dairies Incorporated, he also has 100 registered Brown Swiss and was recently elected as the president of the National Brown Swiss Association. In addition to serving as past president of the Fresno County Farm Bureau, he is currently a senior elected official on the Fresno County Board of Supervisors, where he has been active in shaping water regulations and helping farmers advocate for local control. And rounding out our panel of experts today, we have Dr. Keith Poulson. He's a veterinarian and clinical scientist who specializes in zoonotic and foodborne infectious diseases. He serves as the director of the Wisconsin Veterinary Diagnostics Laboratory and a clinical associate professor in the Medical Sciences Department at the University of Wisconsin-Madison School of Veterinary Medicine. And so, as we divert from Dr. Lombard's presentation to join in with our other experts today, I want to start with this. And Jason, you touched on this a little bit, but maybe go in just a little more depth and recap, if you don't mind. For what we know so far, what do seem to be the lasting effects on cattle as they recover? And that was something that you touched on, is what we don't know is what that next lactation is going to look like. But just if you could capsulize that a little bit again, what do these lasting impacts look like? What are you seeing?
Well, we don't have a lot of information because we haven't had a lot of herds that have gone through and then those cows have entered their next lactation. So we don't have a lot of information on that. I think that the surprising thing to me was, only 50% in that one herd that we looked at, 50% of those cows are still there. And the impact that has on financially is huge. So the amount of milk production might not be near as big as the loss in cows. I think that's a story that's going to need to be told. And the other thing is how variable it is in terms of farms that have 7% of their cows become clinical and none of them die versus farms that have 25% of their cows become clinical and have lots of mortalities, lots of abortions. We still have a lot to look into in that aspect.
And as you touched on that, extreme variability in the mortality rates that relate back to infected cows, were you able to come to anything that you observed that some herds were doing differently, that were able to get cows recovered, faster versus others that had higher death losses?
So most of the information I had is talking to other veterinarians that were on these farms. And they did notice that in cross-ventilated barns, for instance, it seemed like the disease moved a lot faster than it did in open lot facilities. I don't know if that equated to more clinical cases in cross-ventilated barns versus open. So that's one thing. The other thing that we're looking into is we know that dairy cows and cattle in general have other diseases like bovine viral diarrhea, bovine leukemia virus that could cause immunosuppression. The other thing that leads to immunosuppression is pregnancy. How many of these cows are pregnant at the time that they have clinical signs? So we are doing additional testing looking for, is there a correlation between how hard the herd is hit in terms of clinical signs with those other comorbidity or other diseases. We don't have a lot of that testing completed yet.
And with the extreme variability of the cows themselves, as you just alluded to, that adds to a layer of complexity with trying to really determine what are those factors that impact the cows that are able to recover and move on and the ones that just aren't able to do that. So thank you for your efforts. I'm guessing you've been spending a lot of hours and probably getting a little sleep these last few months as you've been studying and tracking H5N1 throughout Colorado and other places as well. And I'm going to divert over to Dr. Poulson here for our next question. As the Wisconsin Veterinary Diagnostics Laboratory Director, can you walk us through what happens when a herd tests positive for H5N1? What are those steps?
So it's dependent on which state you're in. So recognizing a clinical case, talking to your veterinarian, and then the first thing that then happens with testing, and it's usually done in coordination with our state animal health officials, and one that we work with is in the back every day. We're talking to Dr. Roney all the time about suspect cases or what should we be ruling out to be able to get more information. And we work as a team. And then as those tests come into the lab, they go into what we call NALM labs, which is a National Animal Health Laboratory Network. And those results are all covered, all the testing and the session fees and everything is covered by USDA as part of their testing program. And then those results then go directly to the state animal health official and USDA and VSL, and then we refer those samples out. Because those samples going for sequencing then really helps us understand more about what the virus is doing and how it's changing over time. And then what happens to the farm, right? Because that's one of the biggest questions that we have for whether or not should I test or shouldn't I test is, I don't know what's gonna happen. And that's a part that each state is just a little bit different. So I think asking your state animal health official what will happen. And each, when we think about Iowa is looking at herds around their poultry facilities, and they don't have any changes. Colorado is quarantining just lactating animals until they have negative bulk tanks, and that's some of the data that Dr. Lombard talked about. In Wisconsin, we haven't had a positive herd yet, and at that point, if we were to see a detected, we would be contacting the state animal health official's office and deciding what are the most appropriate next steps. And by we, that's not our side, that's coming into the state animal health official, but it's going to be really dependent on the industry and what the early epidemiology or understanding what those connections are to other farms. What does that tell us for the most appropriate way forward? And maybe you have the perspective from Michigan and or California, so maybe that would be a good opportunity as well as what happened to you when you were positive or your neighbors, right? How is that being managed through your states?
And absolutely, thank you, Dr. Poulson. And that's the direction that we'll be headed here and hearing from Brent, who has personally had the experience of dealing with H5N1 on his dairy, and Brian, who has not on his own dairy, but has seen it in his neighborhood, in his own backyard there in California. And so, Brent, let's start with you. Can you walk us through your experience and include in that what that reporting looked like and how that manifested into the actions that were taken on your dairy?
You heard in my introduction that we had a top performing herd. Our somatic cell count average historically has been less than 75,000 somatic cell count. Our co-op pays a premium for every 25,000 incremental, and so I qualified for less than 75,000 for years. That's all gone. In May, our somatic cell count went from 80,000 to 200,000. I freaked out. All of a sudden, we got sick cows. We were pumping them with electrolytes and aspirin. When I'm here, I ought to go over and see the YMPC people because we've used a lot of that. The aspirin people, we've used a lot of aspirin. We have herd health every Monday morning at 7:30. Our veterinarian recently graduated from Michigan State College of Veterinary Medicine. She literally begged me, Brent, will you please report this? Our clinic, they have roughly 30,000 cows in their clinic in central Michigan. And she said, nobody wants to report this. And I said, well, why should I? And she said, we don't have any research whatsoever on this. And I know you have a relationship with Michigan State University. And I finally relented and I said, all right, Courtney, take these two cows that we're pumping, and they both have mastitis. We sent them in, and they coined a new word now, non-negative high count. I wonder where they came up with that. So I'm in, you know. I called the chairman of the board of Michigan milk producers, told him that we had bird flu. He contacted Michigan State University for us. Dr. Rodriguez sent veterinary students from the College of Veterinary Medicine, and those poor gals in the heat had full suits, face masks. It was too hot for them, but they sampled our herd for 8 weeks, and he gave me the results here a couple of weeks ago. 22% of our herd was infected, and that was a high level. That was the highest of the 4 other herds that he had sampled with his students. We're presently trying to clear our herd. We're starting next Monday to get bulk tank samples. And then I have to get a veterinarian out to get the last sample if the other ones are clear. I'm glad that we're still in business. I have friends that are 6 miles away in the turkey business. We farm some of their land. Do you want a stinking rotten mess? They made a compost pile with their animals because they die. Fortunately, the cows get sick, but we lost a few, but the cows get mastitis. That's why they shed the virus. So, and we're about 25 miles from Herbrucks with 5 to 10 million chickens. Can you imagine the stench on those compost piles? And Dr. Lombard was at our farm, and he's got this big long dipper. And he goes, "Where's your manure go?" And he's sampling manure, and I go, "Doctor, why are you doing this?" And he goes, "The poultry people are complaining because they can't spread that manure, and you can." And if you think about the compost, it's just the animals in there, and all of those viruses are airborne. So it would be counterintuitive for those dairy producers that are on DHIA to want to test during bird flu, but we tested right at the peak of it on May 24th, because I did not know how to get rid of the smell. I didn't know who had it, you know. So we tested, and our test was 90 pounds, amazingly, but we were at 110. So we have dropped significantly, and I think this bird flu gets at herds that are higher performing. So we're presently in the mid-90s in production. I've lost a tremendous amount of peak lactations. We've experienced abortions, particularly later lactation cows. We check all cows when we're drying them off. We're now finding some more when we dry off every week. On our herd of 1,250 cows, we have to have 25 cows per week pregnant. We had 14 Monday. At the peak of bird flu, we had 5 pregnant. So it affects reproduction. We are allowed to sell cows, but only to stay in the state and be slaughtered. We fortunately have West Michigan beef. There's a big demand for fresh hamburger. We get paid on hanging weights. And I had 2 condemned 10 days ago. One of them was pneumonia. And I'm going, but you saw the noses. They had it. She was condemned. So we're still suffering. This is October. We've lost peaks in cows. we're still down 5 to 7 pounds a tank average. And historically, we have shipped 7 pounds of protein and butterfat combined. We're not there again. It'll be a while. So I'm really relying on Dr. Lombard when he says we're not sure about how productive the cows are going to be in the next lactation, but I'm excited if you only lose a pound or 2. So.
Yeah, and Brent, thank you for, first of all, your willingness to share your experience and your vulnerability and sharing the realities of just how difficult this has been for a high producing herd like yours. And first of all, seeing it from what it sounds like, that story starts with seeing that change in somatic cell count. And that was one of the first things that really was a red flag. And then the steps and the challenges that have come after that, and that continue to show up as you monitor this disease and how it's impacting your herd. And also the steps that have been taken along the way to continue testing, that you did testing during that critical time when cows were sick, and the continuing testing that you're doing right now. And you spoke a little bit to how it's changed the way that you can handle cattle that you're sending to market. But Miquela, I want to jump over to you for a moment, because one of the concerns that I know a lot of dairy producers have, the most valuable thing that they have ownership of is a market for their milk. And so can you just speak to that for a moment? Is there any concern that a dairy producer should have over how they can market their milk, the ability to do that, and tying that into if your herd has had a positive test for H5N1?
I think it's very natural for dairy farmers to have that fear, obviously, because you need a market to sell your products. But thankfully, FDA has worked very hard to prove that pasteurization effectively kills H5N1 and has at least 2 studies that specifically speaks to that. They also, just a few days ago, released a letter with USDA to the entire dairy industry emphasizing again that pasteurization kills H5N1 and that the milk supply is safe. So they're really trying to put that message forward so that farmers can reduce that fear that they would lose their market and will step forward and test if they find this in their herd. To date, I have not heard of a dairy farmer losing their market if they've come out as positive. And honestly, co-ops, it's not reported to cooperatives or processors if they have a positive farm. That is private data that is kept private.
All right, and thank you for emphasizing the privacy of that data. I think there again is another concern that dairy producers have over reporting, right? Is that information publicly available, and what's the potential outcomes from that? So thank you for clarifying that, Miquela. And Brian, I want to divert over to you now, because as we stated before, you are in an area that is in the last month here heavily impacted by H5N1, yet you have not been yet yourself. So what does that mean for you? What are you doing to proactively take measures to make sure that you can safeguard your herd as much as you possibly can?
Well, in California, it came in because a dairyman from California sold some cows to Idaho. The cows were there for 3 days. The dairyman there did not accept all of the cows, and 30 animals were sent back. It's currently against the law to do that. They weren't tested. They came across the state line, and then the auctioneer sent those out to 3 different herds. I have the good fortune of being the closest neighbor to one of those herds. In California, though, my closest neighbor is 10 miles away. So that's a real blessing for us. But he was the first herd in California, one of the first 3 to get it. He's known as the indexed herd. What that meant is they immediately started a 3-mile radius around the herd. There are no dairies around a 3-mile radius. But what we found within 2 weeks, dairies that were south, the wind blows north to south, those dairies started to become infected. So that had a great concern for me. I voluntarily talked to our California State Veterinary Association, said I voluntarily will test because we have, and as the presenter said earlier, Everyone's learning from this. So there's no playbook as to what to do. So as a county supervisor, I was on the board of supervisors when COVID first hit in 2020. And I can relate it to that because as a county supervisor for our public health, there was no playbook for that. We had to learn as we go. But that gave us the knowledge as to how to handle this. So what I did, I voluntarily went to the state, said, I want to test my milk because we have heard, and again, it's all hearsay because there's no facts, but we have heard that you will see it in your milk. You will test positive in your milk anywhere from 3 to 7 days before you see clinical signs. So I want to know if it's coming. Every Monday I pull the samples. When they first arrived on our farm, they had a technician come in. She gave me this kit and I said, this is foreign to me. Help me. And she said, no, I won't go into your bulk tank. We're not going to spread it. We're not doing that. She helped me at her car fill out the form, but she wouldn't take the samples. She made me do it. I've had the good fortune for 2 weeks to test negative. So I test Monday. I ship the samples on Tuesday. They go to a lab in Davis, California, which is by our state capital in Sacramento. By Thursday, which I'm waiting for that text any time now to tell me if I'm negative or positive. I've done that for 2 weeks. On the third week, I ran out of samples. When she came back this time, for even more preventive measure, she would not drive on my farm. I had to go to the road to get the test samples. And what we've implemented on our farm is, again, having a 1,400 cow herd, we have anywhere, as my colleagues said, we have anywhere from 5 to 15 births a day, and we cannot handle all those. We keep all the females self-contained, but all of our bulls and our Angus animals are shipped out on a daily basis. We are not physically capable of raising all of our calves 100%. So I have to have that trailer come in every day, which I think is the greatest fear of livestock coming in because we are a quote closed herd. I've not purchased a lactating animal come into our herd for years. But again, I have beef that have to leave on a weekly basis. We have these calves that have to leave. So what we've done is we've put everything to the perimeter of the dairy. They still drive in. Our animals are moved. They spray all their tires coming in. They spray their tires leaving. They put booties on. They have plastic gloves. And we load the animals. I have the good fortune that my men cross-reference any other farm or poultry. All of my men are full-time 100%. And we do that as the same thing on our beef. Again, on a herd at our size, we have anywhere from 3 to 5 semi-trucks come in a day to bring feed in. We simply cannot stop them trucks from coming in. I'm glad to hear it's not on the milk trucks because, again, we have 2 tanker loads of milk being shipped out every day. And we have to have that come in. So we've taken the approach on our dairy. We try to be reasonable and practical in what to do, but I have a farm farther down. He's the largest farm in our county. They milk 6,000 cows. They have a uniform company because we have all our employees with uniforms. He makes that man, the delivery man, put on a hazmat suit to deliver the uniforms into the dairy. So there's all different kinds of extremes is what you want to do. Again, I don't know. We can do all that, and maybe a bird flies in, takes a drink out of my trough, and my cow gets it the next day. And if a storm comes in, instead of blowing north to south, the south wind comes in, maybe I'm going to get it from my neighbor now. So we don't know, but we wait with anxious anxiety every week to make sure my herd's positive because I don't want to live through what my colleague here is. And for the reality, in our herds in California, they're obviously a little larger. My good friend has a 2,500 cow dairy. He was the third dairy to get it. They are drenching 400 cows a day to keep them alive. We have to use totes. It's mechanized. They brought in 5 new employees. They start at 5 in the morning and go to 4 in the afternoon. They do it every day. Originally, they had the ear tag monitoring to where they can do that. That was helpful on the first few days because the first day you'll get 5 cows. The second day you'll get 25. The third day you'll get 50. And by day 5, you're hitting 100 head a day. The data is so overwhelming they can't use that system anymore. They just have to physically go out, look at the cow, and know the ones to treat or not. In order to keep track, you'll have to drench them from 1 to 3 days per cow, depending on the cow. You use different color codes of chalk. Monday's green, Tuesday's orange, Wednesday's purple, the next one's pink, in order to keep track. Generally, after 3 days, they're healthy enough on their own, and that's the reality that we have to face. So I anxiously do not want that to happen. I'm going to take every preventive measure that can. But again, the reality is what it is. We don't know how to prevent it 100%, and it is what it is. So.
And then, Brian, you brought up several points that I'd like to revisit, and we'll get to a few of them. But one that I'd like you to share on that we didn't quite touch on there. You talked a little bit about biosecurity with the uniforms for employees, but can you speak to keeping your employees safe, healthy? What does biosecurity look like for your people that are part of your operation?
Well, through the farm program that was implemented several years ago, we generally try to perform the safe measures each and every day, and hopefully none of this ever happens. But now that it has, we feel that we're a little bit more prepared. Our milkers wear gloves. We have aprons for all the milkers. We have hand washing stations everywhere. We strongly encourage our employees after any time of exposure with an animal, whatever it is, wash your hands. We have warm water, soap, everything to do those kind of things. And the reality is we have goggles too. Nobody really wants to wear the goggles. So I have it, I provide it, but I don't mandate them to wear it because it's me as an individual. I don't want to wear it, so I'm not going to make my employee do anything I personally wouldn't want to do. But if you want to wear it and you feel comfortable, it's there for your protection.
So you provide that tool and they have the option as to whether or not they'd like to bring that into their day-to-day. And something else that you were talking about is just these risk factors that you're looking to see how can we mitigate, whether it is where animals are getting picked up on a daily basis, feed coming in, and the direction of the wind, and what if a bird, right, flies into the barn and gets in one of those troughs. And as you explain those different things that come to mind, those are fears that so many producers have. And I can't imagine what it's like when you know that you're that close to these potential risks. But I want to kind of jump back over here to Dr. Lombard, because what have we learned, and you shared some of these things earlier about where the highest levels of risk are. And you talked about vehicles bringing things in. That was, I think you said, a lower level of risk, right? Migratory birds. Now we're looking at that as a lower risk factor. Is that what I heard you share earlier?
Yeah, the migratory birds, there's only been one documented transmission event with migratory waterfowl. The peri-domestic birds I mentioned that have been sampled around farms are frequently negative, and we think that that's the ones that are positive or spillover from the cattle to those birds. I know in Michigan, though, there were a lot of birds that met their fate this summer when that was going around and it spread through the birds. And they do spread a lot of diseases. So that's, I think, that was one of my first challenges, is how is this moving herd to herd? And we've heard about aerosol, and it looks like aerosol. Flu is usually spread through aerosol. Why is this different? The problem is we have no data to confirm how the virus is spreading via aerosol. In experimentally infected animals, they're nasal swab positive for a few days. But how are we getting so much virus that it could become a plume like we know it does from poultry operations and spread from dairy to dairy? And we just don't have any evidence that that's what's going on. There's actually kind of a debate about how this is really being spread. And the people that are doing a lot of the work with the milk are saying milk is the primary way this disease is spread. It's like, okay, I get that when we move lactating cows. When we don't move lactating cows, how is it spread? And that's when they don't have any answers. So then you go back to, well, is it the aerosol spread that's kind of the worst case scenario, because you cannot prevent aerosol spread of disease. There's nothing you can do unless you put them in some kind of chamber. So aerosol is, so you have to back into some of these things. We think milk trucks are high risk because of what they carry. Well, we didn't find that. I'd really like to talk to you, Brian, about looking at milk trucks in California, because just because they weren't a risk in Michigan doesn't mean they're not a risk in California. We talk about personnel and visitors, and we know that talking to some of our dairymen, a lot of the employees ended up with clinical signs. On some farms, a lot of them had conjunctivitis and red eyes. On some farms, they said we didn't see any disease in our workers. But if we do get it in the workers, and now we're starting to hear about human-to-human transmission, are we spreading it with our workers, not just shared workers, but in their social activities that they have. And that's scary too, because you don't want to, how do you even investigate that? We're down to those really tough, determining the tough ways that it's spread. If it's spread aerosol or through employees and owners, those are really tough to prove until we have some data to suggest that yes, this is creating aerosol, and we don't have that data yet.
And that's where the complexity of the spread comes from. And when we look at that complexity and look at where we're sitting right now here at the World Dairy Expo, and this is a place where people congregate that work on dairies and walk on dairies every single day, and cows from across the country. And not far from where we sit right now, there are 2 barns that are full of those cows. And so, Dr. Poulson, I'm guessing you have spent many hours in the last few months contemplating how to handle this situation of of having all of these cows and people in one place here at World Dairy Expo. So talk a little bit about that. How has World Dairy Expo been working to keep cattle safe while they're here, and what does that look like?
That's a great question, and it'll only take about 2 or 3 hours to explain. A lot of the veterinary team has been working out this very specific question. As you think about people and animals coming together, that's how COVID spreads, that's how infectious disease spreads. But I do want to be very cautious on how we think about this. And National Milk has been a great partner at all the different conversations that we've had about what's best for the exhibitors and the animal owners. Because remember, it's not just cows coming to Expo. There are people connected to them. There is a large amount of investment, and there's also a huge component to our culture, right? World Dairy Expo is my favorite week of the year. Now, I'm not alone, and I'm not exhibiting cattle. I've heard that it's infectious, right? It's addicting. And Brian was a reserve ran yesterday, and there's a big component to that for Wisconsin and the dairy industry nationally. So the key point, I think, for the animals coming in is really what we were working with our State Department of Ag, is that all animals coming in for exhibition are tested within 7 days of leading, and they're tested at an Alm lab or in Canada. So we saw 600-ish tests last week just for Wisconsin cows coming in. And then what we think about and where the USDA, their guidance is that on that they can run back on that same test. Some states and Canada have different regulations and needs. So we have to kind of treat them individually about what we can do and how can we meet their needs. Just like if we're exporting embryos or semen to a different, let's say China, we meet their needs, right? What about people? So that's where, when we look at the USDA EPI and things that Dr. Lombard are looking at, is that what about the people moving around and going from farm to farm? And that can be quite challenging at Dairy Expo. So what we've decided, or the information that we've given to the World Dairy Expo Board of Directors, and what they have decided to do is that if you want to come in a little bit later and leave earlier, that's absolutely fine. That has never happened before, right? So if we want to decrease that risk, you can do that, and they maintain those records so they know when cows are coming and going. If you've noticed, there are a few strings that have started to make their way back home. And then if you see something, say something. So as a director of a Alm lab, and I'm not just dressed up for nothing here, I'm on the grounds every day, and I'm out treating cattle and making sure that if there are questions out there, that we can answer them to the best of our ability. And I work very closely with the School of Veterinary Medicine, and then our lab is right next door, about how can we keep the cows at Expo as healthy as possible. So nothing is without risk, but weighing that cost-benefit ratio, and how do we take into account the economics of what's going on, the culture component, the infectious disease risk. This is not without risk, but we're doing everything that we possibly can to make that as minimal as possible.
And what you just shared, Dr. Poulson, is at a large scale of what really often happens in our towns and communities. all across the country in our dairy pockets, right? Congregating of people and people that work with cows.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And what we learned from COVID is that you can't stop the movement of people and you can't stop business continuity. Now, if by stopping it, we have all these unintended consequences and side effects. Now, we can't just let it go, right? I mean, we have other ideas of what we need to do for surveillance or control, but we know we can't just stop it. Just like what Brian was saying, we have lots of producers all over the country that can't just stop all movement. It's not in the animal's best interest or for the farm's best interest because they might not have those facilities. And we have to maintain continuity for not just the farm, because the farm is part of our community. You know, there's an ag implementator, there's veterinarians, there's feed sales, everything kind of comes in together. So we need to be able to continue business continuity for those farms. And it's not a state disease. Our dairy industry, we have tens of thousands of animals moving every single week because it's efficient. And it's best for their animal health and productivity to be able to move to a warm, dry climate to grow, then go to a cooler climate in the north to lactate. So it's pretty complex, and dairy's not alone. We're actually far behind poultry and swine. There are 1 million pigs on the road right now, 24/7, 365. We can't just stop everything. We have to think about it and craft the solution to fit the problem, and I think that's really what data from Dr. Lombard or Drew Magstad in Iowa State, Cornell, Texas A&M, we're working all very hard on this, along with our industry partners, like Wisconsin Cheesemakers has been very involved in biosecurity, and then thinking about how can we understand more about where the virus is going and how is it actually getting there, because the small studies really aren't representing a 5,000 cow dairy. There's something different about it, and we need to know more.
Yeah. And Dr. Poulson, lots of concerns, I'm sure, leading up to this week, but so far, so good?
Yeah, I think that to kind of bring it back to your original question, I kind of got a little bit off the rails there, but we don't have any evidence of any exhibition in the United States being a shedding event. Because animals are testing coming in, we're watching for everything very, very closely. We just haven't seen it. So I think that means our biosecurity is working, and that biosecurity and working to test animals before we know we have a clean population coming in, and we know that we have a clean population going out. Now, are the shows and county fairs smaller? Maybe due to the fear of testing, whether that's fear of market loss, that's the biggest one in Wisconsin, or two, fear of understanding, well, how do I get out of quarantine? What does quarantine look like? Will I be quarantined? You know, we just haven't seen that from shows. And we know that even though it might be smaller throughout this year, we haven't noticed it as a major risk factor.
Thank you for sharing that. And in just a moment, we will get to some best management practices for being able to do exactly what you talked about, Dr. Poulson, earlier, and that's continue with business continuity and to keep this dairy industry moving and rolling at the speed at which transportation leads it to. And you know, I know another concern that I hear from producers, and Brent, I think this is probably one that comes up for you too, is what are the chances of becoming reinfected? I mean, as we get through this first cycle that started last year of H5N1 cases in different places, Dr. Lombard, maybe you have some theories or some research or evidence on any of this, but is it possible to get this twice?
That's a good question. I think that from the herds or the veterinarians that I've spoke with, primarily in Texas, New Mexico area where it kind of started, they were seeing some herds that were kind of looked like they had very similar clinical signs 3 to 4 months later. The problem is that some of those herds didn't test either time. So we don't actually know, is this truly high-path AI or not? Some of them did test the first time and were positive, but when they had this relapse-looking event, they couldn't isolate the virus the second time. So what does that mean? I don't know. I don't know of a herd, Dr. Poulson, I don't know if you've heard of one that actually has confirmed it and then reconfirmed it months later. And then the question is it actually reinfection? Did they get exposed to a new strain of virus? Or did the virus just hang on and circulate through? Because if 22% of your cows have clinical disease, how many were actually exposed? And how many animals are still naive and susceptible to infection if they get exposed in your farm? So we talked about off-site dry cow facilities. As those dry cows come back, are they naive and now they're going to get infected? So that story is, I think, yet to unfold. But we are seeing some herds that definitely seem to have chronic infection, whether that's reinfection or relapse. I don't know.
And in those cases of those herds, is there any difference that you've seen in severity or manifestation?
I haven't spoken with most of them. So the 2 herds we're working with, I don't know if they just kind of keep trickling in with new clinical cases. As far as whether more of those get euthanized, I don't know.
Thank you. So we do have a few minutes to do some question and answers from those of you in the room before we wrap up with Miquela and her best management practices on behalf of National Farms Biosecurity measures. And I see a couple hands going up. I'm going to start in the way back corner. Your question.
Actually, a couple of questions, but I'm going to try and put 2 of those in one here. Why do you think Wisconsin hasn't yet to announce the case, or do you think that, the virus is spreading but nobody is reporting it? And then part of that as well, maybe the producers can speak to this on the panel. Why aren't you reporting? Or I know that there's some fears when it comes to reporting. What needs to be done, do you think, for farmers to not even have a question? Just be like, yes, I need to sign up for this because I need to take care of my herds. Like, how do we remove those barriers?
All right, I'm just going to repeat what I hear in those 2 questions. First question is, why have we not had reported cases here in Wisconsin? Why do these panelists believe we haven't had reported cases? And second, really, what are the barriers to reporting is what you're asking as well on the producer side? All right, and who would like to take maybe question number 1? Dr. Poulson?
Yeah, I could probably speak a little bit to Wisconsin. Wisconsin's dairy industry is a little bit different. We do ship animals all over, especially to hot dry, because between now and April is not good to be raising baby calves in Wisconsin with weather changes. And they're coming back as bred animals. So it's potential that they have been exposed and they've seroconverted, but they aren't shedding a lot of virus. So I do think that helps us quite a bit. We also don't have the same networks because most of our infected farms are multiple hours away. So those epi connections probably aren't as strong as they are in Colorado or California or Idaho where we're seeing a lot of infection. And then how do we know that? Is it just because we're not looking? I think that's a valid point because we don't have regular surveillance, but multiple different laboratories across the country, by meaning research laboratories. We have several here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison are looking at commercial products, and they also look at wastewater surveillance. Now that doesn't direct it specifically to potentially a farm or a processor, but it does give us an idea where virus is moving. And I can tell you we haven't found virus in milk sheds from Wisconsin yet. Could it happen? Absolutely. And that's the reason why we're having a discussion like this is, how do we recognize it early to be prepared, like what Brian is talking about. That is a key point here, is be prepared. And then for the barriers to production, we've gone through that nationally, but I think it'd be better to hear that from producers.
Yes.
Well,
Brian?
I'll do that. I think it's a 2-reason approach. Number 1, I think you should relate it on a human issue and the stigma associated with disease. So if you have a skin disease and it's widely known, people aren't going to want to sit next to you. So if you're an infected herd, your neighbors aren't going to want to come anywhere near you. It's going to create a whole bunch of anxiety for your service industry and all that. I think that's the reality that we deal with. I think the second reason would be on a regulatory issue is the minute you get it, the government comes in, and the notion that we have, at least in California, is I'm with the government, I'm here to help. And we all know that's not the case. You're going to be regulated, you're going to be restricted, and as an owner, we have what we want to do, what we think is best for our herd and our livelihood. Well, the government may have another idea. So the minute you announce it, you're now under government regulation. So again, I believe in being proactive. I'm voluntarily doing it. because for me, the best way to protect my herd is to get ready and know what's coming, because you do have to gear up for it. And that's why I chose voluntarily, and I'm not running from it.
Brent, anything to add?
Yeah, when this disease hit, there was absolutely no research on this. And when my somatic cell count was sky high, I thought, do we have a new source of mastitis? Is this virus? How are we going to counteract this? So I sent some samples in, first of all, to find out which bacteria or whatever it was causing mastitis. And then at Michigan State, they have a lab that runs sensitivities to the bacteria. And so, no, we don't have any new mastitis. It's still strep non-ag, strep uberis, staph non-aureus. Those are the big three in our herd. And amazingly enough, the sensitivity said it's susceptible to spectromast, today, and amoxamast. But it doesn't work on any of them. I mean, you can shoot them up all day. I think this virus just enhances mastitis, and the way they shed it is in the milk. I volunteered because I want to protect our market. Furthermore, I'm not afraid of research. We do research through Michigan State with bovine leukemia, and it's a long-term project to get bovine leukemia in a controlled level. And I also don't mind going to Farm Service Agency. Neither one of my sons wouldn't think about setting foot in there, but they like the checks that they get from there. I know how the program works. I do have a copy of the form. First thing you have to do is send them a positive, that you are positive or non-negative. I do have the form, and it's from USDA through your local FSA office. You will know more than that poor gal that's behind the counter waiting on you. And it's slanted towards what's your death loss. And so I'm still working through this, but we're going to back figure this out by how much production we lost, and that's how many cows we lost, because we lose cows all the time, but it just keel over dead. It's part of dairy farming. So, and a lot of dairymen they don't want to be quarantined, so they can't sell animals. In our situation, I've bred too many to beef. I don't have enough heifers, and so I'm not going to sell a whole lot of cows. I don't buy cows. I don't buy heifers. We'll just not grow as fast as we've grown in the past. So.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing your insights there and the realities of also the process of reporting and being able to have those conversations with the FSA office as well. And we have time for just a couple more questions here before we wrap up.
Yes. Hi, I'm a grad student here at UW. I study reproduction and development of ovary and mammaries. I keep hearing about how this is a really strong shedding of the virus in the mammary gland. You're saying that you're seeing an increased amount of mastitis from it. And I was interested in your dry-off data. And do you think that at any point we might see in animals that have these clinical cases early dry-off for more time for mammary reconstruction and clearance before a new lactation? And do you think that that might help them recover and produce more milk in their next lactation?
So that's a good question. The producers I've talked to, a lot of cows do dry off, and Brent could probably address that too. A lot of the cows do essentially dry off on their own. Whether that's related to whether they potentially freshen back with virus still in their milk, I don't think we have enough data on that yet. But do you have a number or something of the cows that essentially dried themselves off on your farm?
Yeah, that's one of the reasons I tested in the middle of May. I wanted to know which cows lost their peaks. I can't carry these cows for 6 months and then dry them off. But I need cows. We just built a new rotary parlor. I gotta pay for this. So I was vitally concerned about our market. I don't want to get shut off. And so I'm glad that National Milk, FDA is on top of this, showing that it's not a herd health. It's not a health issue for the consumer. Now, if you want something to really freak you out, we're 25 miles from Herbrucks that had those 5-10 million chickens all in compost piles. Center for Disease Control, after I voluntarily said, we'll get tested for bird flu, Center for Disease Control calls me. We want to draw your blood. Okay, so they set up a clinic about 10 miles from Herbrucks down in Belding, Michigan. The assistant herdsman and myself went down one day. I took half of our crew down the next day. They drew blood. It was anonymous. But I did find out later that through the Center for Disease Control, through the state health department, that none of us or any of our employees were positive in the blood. So that was a relief. But that was kind of, are we dealing? It looked to me when the Center for Disease Control showed up, I'm going, they're trying to find another pandemic, and I'm going, oh no, we don't need that. So I'm glad it's not turning into a massive pandemic.
And those are concerns that many of us have in this room is what does this bigger picture look like? However, our purpose of this panel and this session today is to leave you with some take-home messages on what you can do. What you can do to ensure biosecurity as a dairy producer or a person who shows up on dairies and sets foot on dairies, interacts with cattle and other people that are part of this industry. And so in the last few minutes that we have today, I'm going to turn it over to Miquela to go ahead and share some of those best management practices on biosecurity from National Milk Producers Federation.
I will say, I think Brian took most of my talking points, but I'd love to hear that dairy farmers are implementing biosecurity practices on their farm. So, to kind of level set, I did want to introduce everyone to the staircase that we tend to use when it comes to biosecurity. So the National Dairy Farm Program started farm biosecurity a few years ago. And so when we think about farm biosecurity, you start at the getting started level, and then you move into every day. So every day is like good nutrition, good housing, vaccines, all the basic things you do for your cows to keep them healthy. And then when you move to the top of the staircase, that's what we call enhanced, or there's the program called the Secure Milk Supply. So these are the practices you put in place to prevent the spread of foot and mouth disease, or we've also seen that a lot of these practices apply to H5N1 in most cases as well. And we've talked a lot about what we don't know about transmission and all the different ways this could be spreading, but I think these figures do a good job of kind of wrapping up everything that goes into this outbreak. And that Venn diagram kind of looks at what USDA is looking at as a complex web of multiple factors influencing the disease event. And if you want to look more closely at these, I will say USDA has a bunch of briefings on the outbreak on their website. So I to kind of get producers into biosecurity and to start thinking about how the disease could be coming on farm or how it spreads. We have this great resource that is step 1, and it's focused on movement risks. So it really looks at all the different things coming in and off the farm, how often they're coming in and off the farm, to kind of just give you a snapshot, of what you could be bringing on, what you could be sending off. To Brian's point about trucks, so many trucks coming in every day, all that stuff that a farmer can think about to start mitigating their risks. So we heard a lot about animals, vehicles, and people today, which is basically everything on a dairy farm. But I'm going to focus on that. So this is just kind of the full list we have on our website of different biosecurity practices that we have identified that we think will help prevent the spread of H5N1. And Brian did touch on quite a few of these. So the first one, of course, is animal movement. Animal movement is the one thing that we know can spread this virus, for sure. So some things to think about are delaying or stopping incoming or returning cattle from herds of unknown status, and then of course testing those lactating cattle coming on farm. As Jason mentioned, it's mandatory for lactating cattle to be tested if they're moving interstate, but also to think about even within state, and then keeping records of those movements of animals coming on, going off, and just keeping records generally is also a great step. And then in addition to that, if you do have cattle coming on farm, isolating them for at least 30 days. I know that's a good chunk of time, but the incubation period, according to USDA, is 12 to 21 days. So hopefully that will give it time. If it needs to show up, it will before those are exposed to the rest of the herd. Keep off-farm vehicles, equipment away from animals. Again, Brian really did take my talking points on this. So move livestock carcasses to perimeter for pickup, and then restricting off-farm vehicles from shared drive paths. So that's keeping vehicles away from animal areas, places where animals travel, and away from feed. So this kind of goes back to the idea of developing a line of separation on your farm, or I like to think of it as an invisible moat. So things that cross the moat, things that shouldn't cross the moat, and really protecting those animals. And then clean, dedicated footwear and clothing. So prior to arriving, only essential individuals, and I think each farm can decide what's essential to them. But showered, clean clothes, clean footwear, and then disinfecting footwear, booties, everything that can protect people coming on and prevent them from bringing something. And then just to share a few more resources to round us out. So I shared step 1 in everyday biosecurity. This is kind of step 1 in enhanced biosecurity. So it's taking those movement risks you've identified and then plugging them into this and looking at how often they're coming on and off, and then if they would need to cross that line of separation, which is like that invisible moat that you've decided where it is on your farm. And then what you could implement, that if a truck is coming on your farm and it crosses that line of separation, okay, we do need to clean and disinfect it. And then lastly, we do have lots of great resources on the National Milk webpage and also the National Dairy Farm page. We specifically put one-pagers together on biosecurity practices for H5N1, and they are in Spanish and English. And then if anyone wants to go to the website, here's QR codes. But that's all I have. There you go.
Thank you, Miquela. And what you shared is some high-value information, key takeaways, and additional resources on H5N1, how to protect your farms, knowing what we do know, the continued research and efforts that Dr. Lombard and also Dr. Poulson are leading in their respective areas, and more to come as we continue to discover the long-term impacts and some of those question marks that are out there on H5N1. And so with that, please join me in officially thanking our panelists, Dr. Lombard from Colorado State University, Dr. Poulson from right here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison Veterinary School of Diagnostics, and also our dairy producers, Brent, Brian, and Miquela from the National Farm Program for joining us today.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Up-Level Dairy Podcast. I'm your host, Peggy Coffeen, and if you enjoyed this episode, make sure to leave us a 5-star rating or review in your favorite listening app.